Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate. We're looking at the siege of Aleppo. The fall of Aleppo appears imminent. We're with Martin Chuloff. He's the Middle East editor of The Guardian. He's with us from Beirut. Two former ambassadors to Syria from Manchester. Peter Ford, former UK ambassador to Syria from San Francisco. Robert Ford, former U.S. ambassador to Syria, today with the Washington Institute, and here in the studio, Syria commentator Emma Suleiman. Welcome back to the show. Before the break, Emma Suleiman saying that after Aleppo, the eyes are all going to turn to Idlib, where bombing raids by government forces have been taking place. There's also, this was the surprising news, the retaking of the ancient desert city of Palmyra by ISIS. Proof, says France's foreign minister, that Moscow is guilty of, quote, constant lies.
The Russians, who pretend to fight against terrorism, are focusing on Aleppo, and they've given space to the Islamic State group, who are now in the process of taking back Palmyra, which is very symbolic.
Robert Ford, what do you make of Jean-Marc Ayrault's remarks, and is there something the U.S. could do differently in its handling of Moscow?
I don't think there's much the United States can do to influence the Russians at this point. The Russians are all in militarily, but they're all in militarily on behalf of Bashar al-Assad's government. Fighting the Islamic State is a very secondary consideration for the Russians. And there's not much the Americans can do about that, frankly. Looking forward, it would appear to me that the Russians and the Syrians, as the Syrian journalist just mentioned, will probably look towards Idlib, because Idlib remains a threat to Bashar al-Assad's most essential political support base, which is the coastline along the Mediterranean in Latakia province.
Do you share Jean-Marc Ayrault's view that Russia and Bashar al-Assad are still giving ISIS a wide berth?
I would say that there are, from time to time, there are short firefights between them, but something like 70% to 80% of the Russian air raids are conducted not against the Islamic State, but against other opposition groups, particularly the ones in Aleppo and Idlib, for example. And very clearly, the military priority of the Bashar al-Assad government has been fighting the other opposition, not the Islamic State. Syrian Foreign Minister Walid Muallim himself said in September, a couple of months ago, that fighting the Islamic State was not a priority for the Bashar al-Assad government. I wouldn't argue with what the Syrian Foreign Minister himself said.
And what was the American priority and strategy in the last 5 years in helping the moderate opposition? I'd like to ask him that. What was the American strategy, or what did the U.S. do to help the moderate opposition while Mr. Putin was totally involved in Syria and backing up Bashar al-Assad?
Well, I'm certainly not going to defend the Obama administration's handling of the Syrian moderate opposition. I resigned in protest because of it 2.5 years ago. So I would just say, for the viewers, that the American administration, the Obama administration's primary concern in Syria is not the Syrian war between Assad and the opposition. It is solely the Islamic State operating in eastern Syria, and to a lesser extent, the American administration's focus is on the al-Qaeda affiliated Fatah Sham, formerly the Nusra Front. The Americans seem to have given up any real effort at trying to find a political solution and taking the steps necessary to find a political solution to that conflict between Assad and the Syrian opposition.
And how will a Trump administration handle Syria?
We'd all like to know the answer to that question, and we don't know, because on the one hand, Donald Trump wants better relations with Russia, and even the person who is expected to be nominated as Secretary of State, former Exxon company chairman Tillerson, has good relations with Putin. But on the other hand, other advisors to Trump, including his national security advisor designate, General Flynn, as well as the defense secretary designate, General Mattis, both of them have talked about the need to resist and push back against Iranian expansionism. How a Trump administration will balance good relations with Russia while pushing back against the Russian ally Iran, that's a huge question in American political circles, and no one has the answer to that yet.
Martin Chuloff, sitting in Beirut right now, do you get the sense there's kind of this political vacuum ahead of Inauguration Day in the United States?
It certainly is the case, but it's been the case for quite a few months. In the lead up to the presidential election, there was not a lot of political direction at all coming out of Washington, which is certainly projection towards this part of the world, and that had been felt on the various battlefields. The evolution of this conflict, particularly in the last 18 months, is essential to learning how we got to where we are now. And it was mid last year when the Iranians, a general that Robert Ford knows very well, Qasem Soleimani, certainly by reputation, and certainly does Flynn and the defense minister designate know well as well. He took maps to Moscow, put them in front of Putin, and laid them out and said, this is the Alawite heartland here, Tartus and Latakia, which is essential to the survival of the Assad regime, and it is falling. It is about to fall. And the reason for that was that missiles, that the anti-tank missiles that the Saudis had provided were taking a very steady toll on the aging Assad infantry. And it became clear that he was going to lose that part of the country, and that would have meant him losing Syria itself. So what we saw then is Russia and Iran pile in with mutually aligned interests to a point. But certainly after the inauguration, we will see a point where those interests diverge. Russia wants one thing, Iran wants another.
Exactly.
And it does want to secure its influence in Syria as part of its regional ambitions.
And even the Syrians themselves, who are in the regime hold area, do they want Iran in place with the Islamic? Because since Iran has this strong influence on Syria, a lot of things have changed in terms of personal freedom with the Iranian Islamic regime or law. That's why the Syrians themselves, the pro-Assad. The Assad loyalists are actually not happy with the Iranian being empowered or in place.
Martin Chuloff, over the weekend, Russian television broadcasting images of special forces at an undisclosed location in Syria. Do you get the sense that Moscow is getting bogged down?
Well, they're certainly doing well with the air war. I mean, they have pulverized East Aleppo. Rubble is bouncing around there now, and the city, as we've discussed, will fall. And that is a very important symbolic moment in the overall conflict, which is nearing its seventh year now. So that will mean that Russia will bring something to the table after the city falls, and that is they will want to take a stake in what emerges from the ruins of the rest of Syria. So I think to that end, their leverage is quite strong at this point. They will play a role going forward in shaping the character of the post-war state, as will Iran.
Yeah, but eventually, the Russian will have to come down with a solution, because Assad might militarily win, but he cannot win the loyalty of the people, and he has to go for a concession eventually, where and this is where the role of the Russian will come, to make them create a new opposition or create a new alternative where the regime will recreate itself, just to because so far we still have 7 million Syrian outside of Syria, and this is nowhere near any end to this immigration crisis or the refugee crisis.
Peter Ford, how will Russia play it in the end when it comes to interests that right now are convergent with the likes of Iran, but maybe not further down the road?
I think this whole discussion is a bit unreal. It ignores the realities on the ground. Assad was pushed into the arms of the Iranians because of the Saudis and the Americans coming in heavily against him. There is no basic love lost between the secular regime of the Assad and the mullah regime in Tehran. If the pressure is ever released on the government, you will see a normalization of Syria's relation with the rest of the world in its entirety. However, I fear that the Saudis and the other Gulf backers of the rebels will continue to do their worst, and this will give the Iranians the excuse that they need to maintain a presence in Syria. But as regards ISIS, I rather suspect that the Syrian government will reprioritize the fight against ISIS after Trump takes power, not least so that they can begin to establish a working relationship with the Trump administration, which, as was mentioned, attaches a very high priority to this battle against ISIS.
Robert Ford, do you see that, a reset on the part of the Syrian regime, focusing more on ISIS so that they can have this reset moment with the Trump administration?
I don't think the Syrian government is all that concerned one way or the other about relations with Washington. Their relations with the United States generally have been very bad for the last 20 years, and they've lived with that. They have their friends in Moscow and Tehran, and nobody pushed Assad into good relations with Iran. He's enjoyed good relations with Iran for the last 20 years. So it's not new, and the Iranians were deeply involved in Syrian government efforts to repress the uprising as early as 2011. So I would also say from the American angle, despite what Donald Trump has said, there are a series of American sanctions on the Syrian government. Those are legislative, they're laws, and they can't be repealed except by the American Congress passing laws to repeal them. And the American Congress is going exactly the other way. The House of Representatives 2 weeks ago passed additional sanctions against the Syrian government and entities in Iran and Russia that help the Bashar al-Assad government. That draft legislation passed unanimously in the House of Representatives, both Republicans and Democrats. It's now going to the Senate. There is no support in the American Congress to normalize relations with Syria after chemical weapons, after barrel bombing, after innumerable violations of international law, international humanitarian law, Geneva Conventions, etc.
Really, because
So
what I'm seeing, what we saw on the campaign trail, Robert, was...
I'm sorry?
What we saw on the campaign trail was no love for Assad, but what we did see was a lot of indifference.
Well, do not mistake what Donald Trump says and the American legal framework which governs relations between Syria and the United States. He will quickly find, the president will quickly find, that rolling back the sanctions to normalize relations, as Peter Ford would put it, will require laws. And I don't think there's going to be anybody in the American Congress, certainly won't be a majority, that are going to move that way. They're moving the other way.
All right, Syria dividing politicians, creating rifts within the left and the right, here in France, ahead of a presidential election, over in the United States, and in Britain, where this weekend activist Peter Tatchell confronted Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn at an event in London.
Peter, I think...
What's happening in Aleppo
Peter...
is modern-day Guernica. We haven't heard the leader of the Labour Party speak out enough to demand UK airdrop of besieged civilians who are dying in their thousands. Hundreds of thousands of lives are at risk. We expect the leader of the Labour Party to speak out and demand a vote in Parliament on UK airdrop. We will leave it in. We will leave it in.
All right. No, Peter, there's no need to leave. I just like... All right. Okay, guys.
All right, Martin Schulhoff, a bit of a surreal scene there. I've noticed reading your newspaper, The Guardian, that there are divisions between readers and columnists over Syria.
It's been a conflict that has polarised people in ways that I haven't seen in my 11 years as Middle East correspondent. The interests are vested and in some cases extreme, and the narrative is so bitterly contested that facts which should be sacred, which should be precious, are contested at every level. The very reason being is that people want to claim this mantle of truth. It's been a difficult thing to report in the last year when we haven't had the access that we had prior. So we've had to rely on a lot of people that we are now more or less dealing with remotely. We can get across the Turkish border into the northern Syrian countryside to speak to people, but I've become very conscious of the fact that myself and others have not been able to get to where we need to be for a number of reasons. The siege, an inability to trust, and just the chronic danger from such a withering war. And what does that mean for the overall telling of the story? You know what, I'm not sure that it really matters anymore, because narrative has replaced objective truth in so many ways that it's become very, very difficult to actually tell this story in a way which is going to convince anyone on the other side of the narrative of what's taking place.
So hang on. So what you're saying to me is that when you sit down in front of your computer to type after being out in the field, you're saying to yourself, well, half the people won't believe me anyway.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case, and all we can do is crack on, bring rigorously tested facts to the table, be very careful about who we empower, don't be afraid to call a reality when we see it, and also not to be afraid to I guess, shift our understanding of events. And an example of that has been the way that the opposition has changed or devolved or evolved, whatever you want to call it, over time. It's been very important to chronicle that evolution from the initial uprising, which was a popular street uprising within the frame of the Arab awakenings elsewhere. It stayed that way for quite a few years, and Robert Ford was very much amongst that. And certainly over the last 18 months, it must be said that in and around Aleppo and Idlib, as these extreme conditions have set in, there has been a creeping move towards Islamization in both those parts of the country. It must be said, however, when we talk about ISIS, which remains a prominent and unaddressed issue in eastern Syria, it was the opposition in Aleppo and north of Aleppo that forced ISIS out of that area in a 6-week battle in early 2014.
Emma Suleiman, as a Syrian living in Paris, what are your reactions when you see it's been a campaign issue within the primaries of the right that we recently saw ahead of next spring's presidential election? Syria has become this campaign issue here in France.
Not only in France, and in the U.S. as well. We saw this during the debate, between the Clinton and Trump debate, where Syria actually, your position on Syria would make a difference in the vote intentions. The same in Syria is a big question in France, where many people are making their opinion on who to vote to based on their Syria and the relation with Putin, the relationship with Putin. What I would just like to comment on the fact that I think it's not only in the last 18 months. It started in early 2013, where actually both opposition and the regime were doing their maximum to Islamize the population and the move. True, I've witnessed this day by day, and to be honest, since 2 years, I don't believe anything I see, whether from the opposition side or the regime side. It's so difficult to make an opinion or to know what's really going on and to go through fact checking, because there's so much manipulation. There are multiple sides involved in this in this war, and let's not forget that the fact that they internationalized this war has played a major role in the international public opinion internationally, and this is why and help into the increase of populism today.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank Peter Ford so much for joining us from Manchester, Robert Ford from San Francisco, Martin Chuloff from Beirut, Emma Suleiman. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to James Creedon. A perfect seg, because you heard Emma Suleiman talking about how she takes with a grain of salt what both sides are saying at this point in time.
That's right. So certainly there could be disinformation, a lot of disinformation on social media. So I guess you always have to take it with a grain of salt. What you see, we can't.
Do you have to steel yourself, sure. James, when you start to look at Aleppo?
Well, yeah, some of the images are certainly you have to steel yourself for the content, but also certainly you have to be, I think, very careful when you have information coming out of any war zone, because there are interests, there are vested interests, and different points of view are going to emerge. In any case, Umma Charity, which is as the name suggests, an NGO, a charity, they are sharing some images of what they describe as a nightmare continuing, a situation that is catastrophic. I think that's fair to say, no matter what your political allegiance, that from the civilian point of view, the casualties are very great. Julian Ropke tweeting here, one of the last pictures from inside besieged Aleppo today, and he says that Syrian friends have told him that, well, of the 5% of the city that is remaining under rebel control, I guess, that it is being stormed now, and that everyone could, in fact, get killed. Everybody could be a target. Human Rights Watch reporting that doctors in Aleppo claim to have no oxygen canisters left. We have no ICU. The medical situation we are in is reducing us to tears. So that is Human Rights Watch relaying the point of view of a doctor in Aleppo. I guess we can trust Human Rights Watch in that regard. Another image here. Now, there's a video, in fact, which I won't play, François, but this is a video. There are videos emerging showing people being burnt alive. And this, I'm not sure if we'll have audio here. If we could try to get audio on this, what you can hear, if we can get the audio, is cars honking their horns and rifles or gunshots being fired into the air. I'm not sure if we'll have the sound on that, but just take my word for it. What it sounds a little bit like is scenes that you would see. Celebration scenes, what you might imagine after, the victory of a sport. You can hear gunshots being fired there. And also cars being, the horns being honked. And so from that is, I guess, other parts of Aleppo celebrating, according to this particular tweet, what they see as being the brink of victory.
How sad is this? People celebrating the death of others.
Right, and I guess that is also, again...
How sad is this, and how inhuman?
It shows how divided, I guess, the city is, and it's also, that's just one interpretation of what that audio in that video says. Now we're getting to Bana Al-Abed, the 7-year-old girl who's been tweeting her mother has been tweeting a lot of the content, and indeed, if there's anything that shows how divisive the social media aspect of coverage of Aleppo is, I think it's this Twitter account. And this is the last tweet on the account.
Just remind for people who don't know.
She's a 7-year-old girl who has been tweeting for months now about life under siege, and some of the tweets are signed by her mother, others are apparently her tweeting. Now, in this, to give you the context of the tweet first, she's saying that she's very sad that no one is helping. Well, this is her mother, Fatima, saying, "I'm very sad no one is helping us in this world. No one is evacuating me or my daughter. Goodbye." And there were various other tweets relaying how awful the last couple of days have been. This is a tweet from a few days ago, just to give you a sense of the content, where her reading place, she can't go to school, of course, for the last good while, has been bombed, and you see images of that. So you get a sense through this Twitter account of life under siege. But Russian media have been casting doubts about the authenticity of this.
Because it's so hard to authenticate something like this.
Well, in any case,
we have videos of her. There are live videos of her on place.
So the questions that have been asked are, how come is she tweeting in such perfect English? You can see Sputnik English here. It's the Sputnik French page.
Someone is tweeting for her.
And indeed, I think that is the obvious explanation.
And
because of these doubts from coming across on Sputnik and Russian media generally, actually, the mother of Bana spoke to CNN and other media and saying, we are real, we're real people. And indeed, you have videos of a very unwell-looking Bana who's lost a lot of weight, etc. But questions are being asked about not just the authenticity of the account, but of the account, rather, which doesn't seem to be in question, but maybe the political allegiance of the family. So I guess everything is politicized in that climate anyway. So that perhaps shouldn't be a surprise that there might be allegiances of one kind or another.
Yeah, it gets back to what Martin Schuloff was saying, how people take whatever facts there are and see them the way they would like. I want to thank you, James. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.